So humanity, from this brief historical example, are complex beings capable of all sorts of range of things, great achievements and great destruction. So to better understand them and have a little bit of an insight into the human mind and how it got to be the way it is and why we are the way we are, is Jennifer Ouellette is here. She had her genome sequenced, her brain mapped, and her personality typed, and did a few other things, which she'll talk about. And the resulting book is Me, Myself, and Why: What Science Has to Say About Who We Are and How We Got This Way. But this is not her only work. Many of you know she's one of our favorites around here. She's been here a couple of times at least. She's the author of 3 popular science books: The Calculus Diaries, How Math Can Help You Lose Weight, Win in Vegas, and Survive a Zombie Apocalypse. The Physics of the Buffyverse, and Black Bodies and Quantum Cats, Tales from the Annals of Physics. She also edited the Best Online Science Writing in 2012. She's written for many newspapers, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, LA Times, New York Times Book Review, Discover Magazine. She maintains a blog called the Cocktail Party Physics at Scientific American, and she's co-host for Virtually Speaking Science, a weekly science conversation that is aired as a podcast on Blog Talk Radio. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Jennifer Ouellette.
Thank you. I did, in fact, on my way here, accidentally turn into the Pentecostal church. But I realized my mistake right away. As always, I am just stunned and pleasantly surprised at the number of people that come out at 11 a.m. on a Sunday morning, when I would prefer to be home in my PJs, to, hear someone like me talk about, the science of self or physics or calculus or whatever. So thank you all for coming out here. It's interesting. I mean, I was, as he was talking, as Jim was talking, I was thinking of, I don't know if any of you have read Neil Gaiman's Good Omens, but it's a wonderful book, and there's a demon and an angel who kind of join forces to save humanity because they've been on Earth so long that they've forgotten their loyalties, and they actually really kind of like human beings. And one of the reasons they really like human beings is that you get these tremendous acts of grace and these appalling acts of violence, often committed by the same person, which just goes to show, just how unique and ineffable the human condition really is. So, I set out to write a book about the science of self, and it came about rather organically. I normally write about physics and math, so I delved in some very, very new areas for me. But that's also how I learned, by writing books about stuff, so it worked out well. When I wrote the Calculus Diaries, I was always one of those kind of math-phobic people, and part of my identity, part of who I thought I was an English major who was bad at math. And when I was writing the book, I went back and looked at my high school transcripts, just in the interest of thorough research. I wanted to tell people just how bad at math I was, and discovered that I had gotten A's in all my math classes. And it was kind of like a punch in the face, because this was a really core element of my identity. It was the whole reason I resisted science for so long. I had built this whole personal identity around being bad at math and embracing the English major persona. And it turns out I was quite good at both. So where did it come from? Where did I get this notion? And how did that become ingrained into how I self-identified? There's a second tier to this, I'm also an adopted child. There's someone here in the audience who has my last name, Ouellette. And yes, my adoptive parents, my parents, are from the main Quebecois region there. But my biological family is from more the northern Wisconsin area. So I have 2 elements of my identity. I have the part of me that kind of identifies with my French-Canadian adoptive family, and then there's a smaller part of me that, there's clearly some biological, aspects of who I am, physically and some of the other, mentally, and some of the other things that are clearly something I inherited from my biological parents. And that whole nature versus nurture question has always been something of interest to me. So those two things were what kind of motivated me to delve into the science of self. And the first thing I tried to do was define self. And that's when I began to get an inkling for just what I was in for with this book, which turned out to be the most difficult book I've ever written. And that includes the math and physics, because at least there, calculus hasn't really changed in 300 years, and there are set rules. When you get into psychology and neuroscience and genetics and all the cutting-edge research that's being done there, plus just the unpredictability of human behavior and human nature, you've really got a mess on your hands. So how do we define self? And what I found was how you define self depends kind of on who you're talking to, because we're all going to define a little bit differently. A geneticist is really going to focus on the genes and the genetic component of self, maybe to a lesser extent on how those genes influence brain development. A neuroscientist is really going to be looking at your synaptic pathways. There's a saying that you are your synapses, the unique way in which our brains get wired up through a combination of genetic determinism and our life experiences, and that's constantly evolving through our lives. That does, in fact, have a huge role in shaping who we are. But it's not the whole story. Psychology also has quite a bit of useful things to say. The cultural influences, our social interactions, how we see ourselves is influenced by the people that we interact with and how they see us. And we basically, all of those things kind of come together to shape who we are. And then in the end, we all, kind of come up with an idea of who we are based on all these kinds of inputs. So what I'm going to do today is kind of, the self is an onion, with lots and lots of multiple layers, and I'm going to start just peeling back the layers one by one, and we're going to start with the most obvious public face layer and sort of work our way down to the center of the onion of basic consciousness. So that is where we are going with this, and Lord help us all. So, I guess the best way that I thought of to get it to approach this topic is to think of, as friends set you up with a blind date. In this day and age, what do? You don't know anything about this guy or gal, but you do know their name. And so, you trust your friend's judgment to a certain extent, but your friend doesn't know everything about you, and you kind of want to get a sense for who you're going to be dealing with. So you go online and you Google them. There's an entire song called "I Google You," all about cyber stalking, and it's not even necessarily stalking. I mean, this is a way we want to, as a sense of self-preservation, we want to look online and see what cues we can find. And the beauty of the internet age is we can actually learn quite a bit about someone's public persona based on their online presence. I would be actually highly suspicious of someone who had no online presence at this point, below a certain age. I mean, I think there's a generational aspect as well. But you Google me, you're going to find my Facebook page, you're going to find my Twitter account. I've got a blog called Cocktail Party Physics, and you can actually get a pretty good sense from the way I write and from what I post and the links and the movies that I like and who my friends are. Look at who my social networks are. You can get a pretty good sense in broad strokes of who I am. It's interesting because I remember someone objecting very strenuously. I'm very careful about who I friend on Facebook these days. My Twitter and my G+ and my blog are all very, very public, and increasingly I've been keeping Facebook very private, although everyone can subscribe to my public feed, and honestly, most of my stuff is public. But I tend to look at when people send me friend requests, I used to always look at their profile to try and figure out if this was someone that, I would be simpatico with. I was looking for cues, and someone got really angry with me and said, "You can't tell anything about me from my Facebook page." And I went, "Science disagrees." There was a study back in 2010, 2011 called Mirror, Mirror on the Facebook Wall, and it turns out that your Facebook page is one gigantic identity claim. It's one huge public statement, "This is who I am." In that respect, social networking sites, it's really not anything new. It's simply a new medium. We have always chosen how to present ourselves to the public, who we think we are, our likes, our dislikes, the books we like, the music, our political or religious views. And if you take those personality quizzes, those are, it tells you a little bit, when you get the result and you're happy or excited about it, it tells us something about who you think you are. So it may not tell us who you are exactly, but it'll tell you who you think you are and how you like to be seen. And in that respect, you can actually learn a lot about whether that person is someone you want to go on a date with, for example, to use our current method. And your avatar is a virtual extension of yourself. Jim mentioned that I host a virtually speaking science podcast on Blog Talk Radio. The conversation takes place in Second Life, which is a bit of a virtual world ghost town these days. They're working on an updated version. It's badly needed. I'm really excited about the new one that they're supposed to be debuting. But it's a lot of fun, in part because you get to build an avatar, a pixelated representation of yourself. And I already had one for my blog. I had a little mood icon, a little person that I nicknamed Jen-Luc Piquant. It is, in fact, now my Twitter handle. And an interesting thing happened when I created her. She kind of, for a while there, took on a personality of her own. She became a full-blown character that was not me. She had an entire backstory, and she would make snarky comments, and, she ran off to Vegas with Crackle from Snap, Crackle, and Pop one point for an ill-advised, later annulled marriage. She says these are lies, vicious lies, but she's upscating a little bit. So when I moved into the Second Life realm, it just made sense to call her Jen-Luc Piquant. And so now she has a full-bodied representation. My husband, Sean Carroll, is known as Seamus Tomorrow in Second Life, and we have a house and a cat and the whole bit. And what I do is I invite scientists into this virtual realm, and it's pretty much like an hour-long podcast conversation. With one exception, they have to join Second Life and build an avatar. And what's fascinating to me is watching what they choose. For example, we've got Malcolm MacGyver here, who down here, I don't know if you can see him. He is a roboticist, works a lot on the connection between the mind-body experience and how to build better robots based on how we move in physical space. He's got some really intriguing ideas on that score. He built essentially a biomimetic robotic fish that kind of moves through the water, like the biologically inspired fish that he studies. And he kind of went all steampunky and artistic, which I kind of liked. Maria Konnikova, which is a little to the far, my right there, your left. She's a psychologist who wrote Mastermind, How to Think Like Sherlock Holmes, a wonderful book. But she's also, her personality, she kind of just wanted a very simple representation of her, and it really does look very much like her if you met her in real life. Jana Levin, the astrophysicist, got all funky and went for a unicorn with bunny ears. We had to inform her that technically she was naked, so she went and she got a little punk dress to put over her. Although she made an argument, and I thought it was valid, that if you're a unicorn, there's no such thing as naked. And my personal favorite, right here to my immediate right, is Simon Dedeo is a complexity scientist, and he chose as his avatar a swarm of butterflies. And that is about as abstract and cerebral as a choice of self-representation can get, but it gives you a sense of the range of what is possible with these avatars, and it also should give you a sense of why we like them so much. I was surprised to find that while most of us really hate looking at pictures of ourselves, we're very, very enamored of the look of our avatars. We could stare at our avatars all day. There is a camera in Second Life, and invariably people will turn it around so it's not from your avatar's perspective. You want to look at your avatar, you want to watch your avatar. It becomes very much an extension of you. And it's an intriguing sort of thing. And one of the reasons I think for that is because every single one of us has a sense that our physical self does not accurately represent who we are, and this goes way beyond body image. I mean, we always have this sense that maybe there's something about us that we feel is really central that is not conveyed in our physical presence, and we're able to tap into those things when we build an avatar, and we're invested in that avatar very emotionally, and we're psychologically connected to that avatar. It becomes a very, very important way that we extend our public self and the way that we express ourselves. And for people who have any kind of a motor disability, I mean, I was surprised to find, I shouldn't have been surprised, but I was, that there's an entire community of disabled people who, for Second Life, this is their life. This actually gives them a way to dance and have sex and interact with people in a social place, and they can build a body that is not broken and experience a very rich inner life that way. It's a way for them to kind of express what's happening to them internally in a way they can no longer do physically. And that's just an extreme example of what is possible. So again, point of all of this really is that you can in fact tell quite a bit about someone for what they choose to show you online. But eventually you want to take it into the real world, right? And you meet for that fateful first date, and you sit across the table and you have that awkward, so tell me about yourself. And, you've already kind of figured out through your online snooping who this person thinks they are. And you know that they're going to basically be putting their best foot forward, and they're going to be, editing a little bit because it's a first meeting. So, maybe science can help you get like a better view, of who this person is. Now, if you really wanted to be really thorough about it, you would do what a physicist would do, and you would basically have a mapping of every single particle in your body, and you would just present them with this sort of analysis, that would be like about this thick and and very, very difficult to read, and say, here are my particle interactions. They are for you. They would probably run screaming in the other direction unless you happen to be sitting across from someone at Caltech. My husband tells me at Caltech that's considered kind of hot. But, we do have, throughout history, we've always tried to come up with ways to figure out who people are. And, this is the whole matchmaking model. And I'm going to many of you, I think, as good skeptics and atheists will be aware of many of these things. We've got the zodiac, astrology. Human beings have this need to seek out patterns, and at some point someone noticed a way to categorize people's personalities based on the position of the stars in the sky, and the zodiac was born, and it kind of evolved and developed. This is actually a very normal thing for humans to do. One of the ways that we function, that the brain functions, is when we meet someone, we kind of build a model or schema. A psychologist calls it schema, a neuroscientist might call it a prior. And we start to build a model of this person. And as we get more information, we flesh that model out. And then we really, really expect the person to follow the model that we have built for them. And if their behavior deviates from that in any way, we find it extremely upsetting. So we will actually go to great lengths to convince ourselves that our astrological sign, for example, really does describe who we are. Many of you are familiar with the Fourier effect. This is a guy named Bernard Fourier who just randomly gave his subjects descriptions of their astrological signs. They were just randomly. They had nothing to do with what their actual astrological sign was. And he found that 98% of them, 95 to 98% of them actually felt that it described them to a T. And it really was just random. But there were other things as well. When I was growing up, I had an evangelical upbringing, and there was a book that my mother had me read called The Four Spiritual Temperaments, and it really was literally medieval. It was based on the medieval humors, as I discovered when I went to college and studied medieval literature and history and philosophy, and phlegmatic, melancholic, sanguine, and choleric. These are just different kinds of biles or bodily fluids that people felt influenced not just your health, but also your personality and your moods. Depression, for example, was considered to be an overabundance of black bile, the melancholia. Again, a way that people were trying to find, patterns and ways to categorize people, because that's what we do. We want people to fit into categories, want to be able to sort, because otherwise the world is just too confusing. And then later on, very briefly, we had the head bumps. People who thought that, based on certain bumps in the head and the cranium, they would become bigger, for example, if someone was particularly greedy or had particularly low or high self-esteem. And my personal favorite was amorousness, which the guy who developed this apparently discovered when a lusty widow fainted in his arms, and he felt this sort of protruding knob at the back of her skull. And since she was so, shall we say, horny, he just assumed that it was because of that. Correlation does not always mean causation. I took the Myers-Briggs type indicator, which is, when I talk to a psychologist, people who, personality psychologists about this, I would say, how do you feel about the Myers-Briggs? And they would look really abashed and say, we don't really want to completely discount it. On the other hand, it's really not useful for our research, and it's kind of our problem child. It's really, really popular, and they like the fact that it gets people thinking about personality traits and about themselves. It has the obvious problem of being purely self-reported. It was developed, it's based on Jung, actually, but it was a book that Jung wrote identifying these three axes of personality, extroversion versus introversion being the most obvious. And a mother-daughter team, most prominently Isabella Briggs, the daughter, decided that she was going to develop a more accurate personality type test. And she added a fourth axis, and she conducted loads of field research among her friends and adapted it. It's essentially a forced choice quiz. This situation, would you do this or this? This situation, would you do this or this? And, you try and get like 150 to 200 of those, and then it all gets added together. And it shoots out this type. I am an INTJ, apparently, or an INFJ, depending on what day. And it turns out, of course, that when I actually took the test this time, I came out as an extrovert, which really surprised everybody. When I was talking to the counselor, because they have someone walk you through your test results, and I did that for the book. He basically ended up discounting that from talking to me. He says, "Well, I don't know what happened because you're definitely not an extrovert." And I think what happened was, I'm actually, kind of an introverted, shy person, but because I'm older now, and over the course of my life and writing books and having to give talks, there was a time at 25 or 30 when I would have, rather than talking to you, I would have been curled up in a puddle of anxiety over here. And I'm not, and that's because we can adjust and adapt. And, personality is not fixed, as the Myers-Briggs maintains. There might be some certain basic temperament things that are pretty permanent, but we would never be able to function if they were really rigidly fixed. The whole beauty of the human self is that it's so amazingly flexible. That's part of what makes it so robust. So in order to be able to function in the world, we need to be able to adapt. And that is definitely something that happens. So by the time I took the Myers-Briggs test in my 40s, I very much had moved up on the spectrum in terms of the introversion-extroversion. So what I learned from talking to personality psychologists was that really personality is not as simple as a set fixed category, even if you try to make that category complicated, even if you have 4 different types that you can all combine together and you get these 16 different things. That's still not enough. Personality is actually more of a continuum. It's not that you're either extroverted or introverted. We each have a certain degree of extroversion. There's this one thing called extroversion, and we all fall at different points on the continuum. And if you're really, really introverted, you're going to be over here, and if you're really extroverted, you're going to be over here. Most of us are kind of in the middle, and fall on one side or the other. So really, on the Myers-Briggs, you could answer just a couple of those questions slightly differently, and you would be an entirely different type. And that's the problem with the Myers-Briggs. So it can have some usefulness in terms of getting you to think about personality traits and why people act the way they do in different situations, why a different person will choose to act differently than you in the same situation. But beyond that, it's not really, really useful for research. They actually use something called the Big Five model, which again is self-reported, but they've found ways to augment that by interviewing friends and family and using behavioral monitoring, actual data tracking of the person. And they augment that in order to get a more complete picture. So personality psychologists are actually doing some very interesting things to overcome the inherent shortcomings, I think, of their studies. So, okay, personality type probably doesn't tell you much about this person other than, again, who they think they are because it's self-reported data. What you really want is an objective measure. And you got to figure that the brain is the center of the self, right? So I decided to get a brain scan, and David Eagleman, who is a neuroscientist in Houston, I met him at a conference, and he very graciously invited me down to participate in one of his studies. It was not completed at the time of my book because science doesn't care about my deadlines. I just saw David at the World Science Festival, and I said, "When is the study coming out?" And he said, "Soon, and it'll be great. So I'll be able to write an update in about 6 months." It did not actually tell me very much about me, and there's a reason why. We have this notion when we think of an fMRI or a brain scan that it takes a snapshot of the brain in action because we get these beautiful pictures, right? And that has to be, that little plaything that lights up. That's us thinking. And it's not actually what it is. It's a statistical representation of a whole bunch of data. And it's not really that only one part of your brain is lighting up. That just happens to be where the oxygen increase, the blood flow increases the most, so it's probably the most active, enough to push it over a certain critical threshold. The other problem is I was participating in a group study and not an individual scan. So a whole bunch of us took the same cognitive test where we basically get put in the machine, we're all hooked up, and then we just press a button in response to certain cognitive cues. And then our input gets mashed together with everybody else's, and they look for areas of commonality, and that's what is going to end up in David's paper, along with a very nice image of a single brain that will actually be all our stuff compiled together, because he's looking for commonalities. It's much, much harder to fMRI, to do an fMRI of an individual person. I would have had to have been there for hours taking the same test 150 times in order to get any kind of statistically significant sample. And even then, it would have been very, very difficult because of what little we know of the brain so far to say anything about it. There's been some interesting work from a guy who has managed to kind of recreate what, scenes from movies, what movies people are watching. But if you actually look at the data, I mean, it's amazing they can do it at all, but it's not great, and there's a lot of priming that gets done on those subjects. And I'm just going to, in passing, mention something that may be familiar to you, the dead salmon study. That's this little, down at the bottom right-hand corner there. MRI machines have to be calibrated, and that task usually falls to the poor graduate students. And sometimes those graduate students get bored and decide, well, let's try and figure out different ways. Normally they calibrate it by filling up a balloon with mineral oil or something, because they want something with good contrast. So they put in a watermelon, and they put in something else, and then they decided, what if we put a salmon in there? So one Saturday morning, this grad student goes to the local fish shop, and he gets a full-fledged salmon, and he puts it in the MRI machine, and they ask it questions about what it's feeling, how it responds. And, it was he was surprised to find that he got a signal from a dead fish. It's sometimes misunderstood. And he wrote a paper about it and presented a poster session, and it became a very famous a thing. It actually made this grad student's career briefly. And a part of that is, it doesn't really say that fMRI doesn't work. What it says is he identified a really crucial flaw in the processing of the data, that you actually need to add an extra layer of analysis to get rid of false positives, because you will get things like the dead salmon. So it ended up being, this is just a way of illustrating just how complicated the fMRI is. The only thing I learned was A, I don't have a brain tumor, and B, my sinuses are very clear. And because they let you stroll through a picture of your brain on this big screen with the mouse, and I'm zooming in and out, and I said, what's this big empty black space there? Because I find that very disturbing. And and he says, that's your sinus cavity, and having it empty and black is good. It means your sinuses are clear. And I went, can you tell if someone has a cold? He goes, oh yeah, we've had people come in here with allergies, and it is not pretty. So fortunately, there's a new thing now that we can get. I mean, what you really want is a really detailed report. And this is about as sciencey as it can get with your date. You hand them a copy of your 23andMe genotyping analysis. 23andMe is a startup company. There's several of these now. I just chose it because I happened to bump into Ann Wojcicki at a conference again, and she invited me to, after I took the test, that she invited to hook me up with one of her genetic counselors. So first of all, I already had someone personally walk me through my results at the company, which helped a lot. But their website actually is very instructive. So what they basically do here is you spit into a tube and you shake it up, with a little solution, and you send it off to a series of lab technicians, and then a few weeks later you get your results back. And it gives you something that looks like this. They are not doing the whole genome. They're basically looking at things called SNPs. These are little markers on the genetic markers, variants of genes known to be associated fairly strongly with certain traits, to varying degrees. One of the reasons that I liked 23andMe's site is that they will actually rank their results on confidence level. This is based on really robust studies, about 50 years of data. This is good. There's only one or two studies, and it's really tentative, and I wouldn't put too much stock in it. You need to do that when you look at your genotype results, particularly when you're looking at medical risks. So it's not complete, and as a result of that, it can be a little misleading. Now, you can find out the obvious things like eye and hair color, earwax consistency, which, you can just test on your date. Ethnic ancestry, I'd always been told that, my biological father was Norwegian and my biological mother was French and Irish. And let me tell you, I am Northern European based on 23andMe. They nailed me. I was right up there in Scandinavia. I'm also very sensitive. I'm one of those super tasters, really sensitive to bitter taste. So, broccoli and Brussels sprouts and things like that, to people who don't have, people who are not as susceptible to bitterness, those things taste really good. And to me, it just grates. And there's also certain health risks, which, I tended, again, to be very, very careful on those. And you need to be careful in part because, for example, women, we were very concerned about breast cancer, and 23andMe does do a test for certain breast cancer risks, but it doesn't test, or it didn't at the time I took it, the two most common, the BRCA genes, because those were patented at the time by a company called Myriad Genetics. This is a whole policy issue that was overturned in 2012, right before the book or 2013, right before my book came out. So I was able to update it to reflect that. So what they tested for was other aspects of genetic variants known to be associated with breast cancer, and the only problem with that is it's a genetic variant that's really only found in Ashkenazi Jews. So you need to look at the fine print when you look at your health results. But you can find some surprising things. For example, I found out that I, according to 23andMe, had a slightly elevated risk of alcoholism, which practically makes everyone I know fall off their chairs laughing. Because I am, in fact, the anti-alcoholic. I am an incorrigible lightweight. I am a 2-drink girl all the way, and it's just never. I would just never have. I don't have any of the behaviors. So why? Why did I get this result? And part of it is the reason that I told you. I mean, they only test for a few things, and there's a whole bunch of different genes that go into determining or influencing whether or not someone becomes an alcoholic. We do know that it's highly hereditary. There's about a 50% hereditary marker, people think, but there's a whole bunch of different genes that contribute to that. And part of the way it contributes is it may or may not determine how certain brain pathways form, and then certain behaviors and experiences might shape the brain further and push it one way or another. So it becomes a very intricate mix. So my key finding, the reason I spent an entire chapter on alcoholism, was that we have this notion that we learn in grade school or high school about the Mendelian model, the sweet peas, about how hereditary stuff works. And that's not how it works. There's no single gene for height, for example. I was surprised to find this, because the height is easily identifiable. You can easily measure it. It's 90% hereditary, and yet there's probably 15 to 25 different genes that we know about that somehow contribute to how tall a person ends up being. The same thing with eye color, and absolutely true of something like alcoholism, which is really more of a set of behaviors that might be indicative of traits. So when you ask, are alcoholics born or made, science equivocates and says, it's a bit of both, actually, because it's a complex behavior, and you cannot reduce that to traits. So I wanted to find out why I was such a lightweight, and it happened to hear of a woman speak. Her name's Ulrike Heberlein. At the time, she was in San Francisco. She's since moved to the Howard Hughes Institute. She has spent years working with drunken fruit flies. I mean, I'm serious. She gets fruit flies drunk for a living. And you can see her little inebriometer there. She fills these long tubes with ethanol vapor, and the flies kind of go in there at the top, and they gradually breathe in the fumes and get progressively drunker. And I went to visit her lab, and it is so much fun to watch, because we can't help but project, but you could actually watch the motor coordination start to go away. They get really happy, It's like their inhibitions are gone, they're life of the party, and then they start to kind of stumble around a little, and then they start to hit on the wrong gender. Start mounting fellow male fruit flies and things like that. And then finally, they just kind of pass out. I mean, they literally fall to the bottom of the tube, and you can see them kind of struggling. And that's that point where your friend decides the pavement is just really comfortable and they're just going to go to sleep right there. That's exactly what they do. And they just pass out. And their little legs this all happens in a microscope because they're tiny. Their little legs are kind of like, they're dreaming and they're kicking off, but they're just... And so what she does is she breeds batches of them, and she knocks out one specific gene at a time, and she looks at the effects on tolerance. And it's very painstaking. It's taken her decades, and what she's found is a collection of different genes that definitely contribute to things like tolerance. And this is one reason that I am such a cheap date. One batch of flies she actually literally called Cheap Date. That is actually the name of the batch that she made. Because, like me, they do not build up any kind of tolerance. Usually, people who build up a tolerance means that's what happens when you have to keep drinking more and more to get the same effect. And that kind of person is therefore going to be much more likely to develop a drinking problem because they have to keep drinking more to get the same effect. And that doesn't happen with me. I just, really, 2 drinks is it, and I'm the same place no matter what. And her cheap date flies are exactly the same way. She's also got a batch that she calls Barfly. There's a Tipsy batch. There's all these various. She's got these really clever names. But these are fruit flies, and it's not you can't just say, well, they're fruit flies, and therefore humans operate the same way. You get clues about where to look, but really you want to kind of bring it up to a mammalian model first. So I found a guy who worked with mice. Nicholas Graham. He does the opposite of what Ulrike does, where she's kind of genetically engineering her batches. He's doing it the good old-fashioned natural directed selection, selected evolution way, where he just breeds batches. He self-selects the mice that seem to handle the alcohol the best, and he only breeds those, and he does this over several generations. He doesn't always know what he's done on the genetic level, but that's why he has a control group. So he did this over, again, a decade and just over several generations of these mice. And the end result was the ultimate binge drinking machines. I mean, I was interviewing him on the phone. And he goes, I'm telling you, they got drunker than any animal model has ever gotten drunker before. And he'd put them on little balance beams just to measure coordination and things like that, and they couldn't even, they were just like, yeah, whatever. So again, they were able to kind of know now where to look. It's still, again, much more complicated to scale up to humans, but we do know that there are some genetic factors, and one of them is this gene GABRB1. I don't even want to pretend to try and pronounce it. Genetics people out there, you've got to get better nicknames. You've got to have something like Cheap Date to help us out here. It actually affects a neurotransmitter called GABA. There's often a saying that alcoholics are kind of self-medicating, and there is some evidence that people with a certain variant actually do need a little bit extra in that regard, and alcohol is one of the ways that they can get that. There's also a dopamine receptor gene that dictates a little bit how we respond to alcohol. And when I was talking to Nicholas Graham, he and I are the same. When we drink alcohol, it affects us very differently than it does someone who is maybe a classic alcoholic. We get kind of sleepy and sluggish and maybe even a little nauseous if we drink too much, whereas someone else might get really enervated and it'll make them feel really, really good. And so how we react to the effects of alcohol is another factor. And then there's all kinds of other factors as well. There is, parental guidance. A really strict upbringing might help you up to a point. Peer pressure becomes more important once you get into high school. As I mentioned, there's an aspect of, how the brain gets wired up. It turns out that most alcoholics have what's known as a teen brain. They have problems with impulse control. Which we tend to associate with teenagers. So impulsivity as a personality trait, if you have high levels of impulsivity and thrill-seeking behavior, if that's a personality trait that you have and you're really extroverted to boot, again, it's going to push you a little further. So it's more an accumulation of all these things, and for a certain percentage of the population, they just hit the mother lode, they hit the trifecta, and it pushes them over the critical edge. So I like that fact because it's, it doesn't blame the person in the sense that you're just weak. An alcoholic actually has to work much, much harder not to drink than I do. The only other caveat I would say when I talked to Ulrike and to Nicholas Graham, they said, well, you don't want to put too much blame on them. You don't want to say it's all your fault. But on the other hand, we do have something that fruit flies and mice lack, and that is this wonderful frontal cortex. We actually do have the means to control it, but it can be difficult. And you just recognize that someone may be working at a disadvantage to you. It's hard if you don't have a drinking problem to understand what an addict actually goes through. So that's just how complicated this is. That's just alcohol. What happens when behavior meets identity? And you go on a date with someone, you're clicking, you actually really like them, and you have to ask yourself at some point, want to make sure that they actually are attracted to me in the way I want them to be attracted to me, and maybe they like me a lot, but they are actually attracted to something that is not me. I hope he is not gay. And this is the classic Seinfeld, not that there's anything wrong with that. And a lot of this, again, has to do with social cues. Remember I mentioned that we have these schema for individuals, but we also just have it for broad swathes of society. We have this notion through cultural conditioning of how men and women are supposed to look or behave or dress. It's going to vary to a certain extent from person to person, but we are going to have those, and they're going to be very, very deeply ingrained. And I think the line in the Seinfeld episode, people were asking Jerry, why do people always think you're gay? He goes, I'm thin, single, and neat. And he's close to 40, and if that's he must be gay. But of course he wasn't. And so this, again, is a very, very messy area. This was the chapter that nearly killed me. But it was very instructive because I found that, for one thing, one part of the problem is that we confuse gender expression with sexual orientation, particularly when it comes to men, although that hasn't always been the case. It's much more socially acceptable to be a little tomboy, like Scout from To Kill a Mockingbird over there, although at the time that the book was written, she was considered a freak, and there's all these wonderful passages in the novel about being forced to wear dresses, and I was that little girl, and there's a reason it's one of my favorite books. To the extreme, you have Eddie Izzard, a famous British comedian who for years and years would perform, I guess what you'd call in drag on stage, and people would often say, he's a straight man. He's not transgendered, he's not a transsexual, he's not any of those things. He just likes the feel of women's clothes, and he likes playing with his gender expression. And he was asked once why he wore women's clothes, and he just said, they're not women's clothes, they're my clothes, I bought them. And, Iggy Pop also, famously ended up in jail, and his manager came to pick him up and found him like in a dress. And he goes, "Why are you wearing a woman's dress?" He goes, "I beg to differ. This is a man's dress." And Iggy Pop is still actually posing, even at his advanced age, with his ravaged face and his long hair. He still occasionally poses in dresses. He's still playing with our culturally conditioned notions of gender expression and what is appropriate. And this is actually a male model whose name currently escapes me, but there's also a female model who routinely models male's clothes. He will go back and forth modeling male and female clothes, and that should tell you a lot about what the modeling industry expects of women. They want us to be very tall, thin men. So the best way to think about sex and gender is to think of it as, again, a mix and match world. And Sean came up with this notion of the tesseract of sex and gender. We basically have, in the same way that we try and fit people into personality types, we try and do the same thing with sex and gender. You're gay, you're straight, you're a man, you're a woman, and it's actually not that simple. So there's 4 aspects. There's gender identity, how you think of yourself, which may or may not match your biological sex, which again is hard to define. I mean, traditionally it's always been defined by whether you have XX or XY chromosomes, but as as science has found, there's a growing number of people who qualify as intersex. I have an example there of Caster Semenya. She is a sprinter. She won a gold medal, and when they tested her, they found that she is, in fact, technically, if you're going by chromosomes, XY. Her genitalia, her outward genitalia, are in fact female. She has breasts. She probably has a little bit more testosterone than the average woman. And part of that, but she has testes. What she lacks, rather than ovaries, and what she lacks is a certain hormone receptor. So she makes the male hormone testosterone, but she doesn't have the receptors, so she developed as a female. And she identifies as a woman. And it raised this very sticky question, should people like that, and that was actually a quote, people like that shouldn't be allowed to compete, it's not fair. Because she has more muscle, she builds muscle faster, she's got more testosterone. Does that give her an unfair advantage? And I was pleased that a Stanford panel concluded it did not necessarily, because there's certainly much more to being a powerful runner and sprinter than your testosterone levels. But it does raise, these sorts of intersex people are quite common. Much more common than we think, and the better we get in terms of science being able to test at these deeper levels, the more we realize that biological sex is not as cut and dried as we thought it was. Sexual orientation, to whom we are attracted. That again, it's very, very difficult to tease out whether it's, there does seem to be something innate about it, but it also seems to be very flexible. There's a cultural element that is very difficult to tease out from the more genetic and neuroscience components of it. Most famous example, Cynthia Nixon, the actress, angered the gay and lesbian community when she made the line, "I've been straight and I've been gay, and I think gay is better," because it implied it was a choice. For her, it was. She happens to be bisexual. So she can, and I think it also evolved for her to a certain extent. There's a certain fluidity in our sexual orientation. And what happens is we want people to fit these labels. And when they don't, when they, like Cynthia Nixon, break out of it, it upsets people. Pick one, be one or the other. And one of the people that I interviewed for the book, anonymously, under a pseudonym, self-identifies as genderqueer. And that's this case where, are you a girl or a boy? No. No, and this is a person who likes the pronoun he and had his breasts removed, but doesn't really want to go full and get like a whole transgender assignment, because there's parts of him that like the female aspects, and the sexuality. I mean, primarily attracted to other genderqueer people, followed by women, followed by men, but is pretty kind of open to anything. And the gender expression is predominantly female because he's actually quite small and petite and just looks like a tomboy most of the time. So any one person can fall anywhere along the spectrum for either any four of these categories, and it's a mix and match world, not this whole binary thing that we've grown accustomed to thinking about. And that's really what I want to leave you with when it comes to sex and gender is, not to get caught up in this notion of whether we're born this way or not, but just basically say people can fall anywhere along this tesseract in terms of this very four-dimensional spectrum, and that maybe we should allow people the freedom to define themselves and how they wish to be seen. So now we're getting down to the nitty-gritty stuff, because now we're done with all the messy, confusing stuff. We want to get down to the central question. The best definition that I found of self was William James, believe it or not, because it was the most inclusive. He said that the self is the sum total of all that a man can call his. Not only his body and his psychic powers, but his clothes and his wife and children, his ancestors and friends, his reputation and works, his lands and horses and yacht and bank accounts, which tells you right there that he came from a very privileged life. My yacht does not actually count in my definition of self because it is non-existent. But what is the core self? We have this sense of what is often called the militant I. So there may be lots of different layers to the self and lots of different aspects to how we construct identity, but we do have this notion of an I, and where is it? And is there a central place where that exists, and can we find it? And that has been the notion of consciousness. So to find out, I did another kind of experiment involving LSD, believe it or not. And now that you've heard about what a lightweight I am, you can imagine how I respond to drugs. I just don't do them. But I was talking to a friend of ours over dinner several years ago, and when I was just starting the book, and told him I was working on this book about how we construct identity. And he said, well, in that case, you really need to try acid. And I says, oh, you old hippies are all the same. You're always trying to get me to, try acid, and like it's supposed to be this great experience. He goes, no, that's not what I'm saying. He goes, if you are interested in how we construct self, how the brain actually constructs reality and our perceptions of it, then you absolutely must do this. And he convinced me. I apologized for the hippie remark, and we became friends, and he hooked us up. He loaned us his beach house, which was really kind of him, and my husband and I both went for like an extended weekend, and took it in the morning, and we went walking on the beach when it started to kick in, and there's this moment where suddenly reality just shifts as the drug kicks in, and I looked down, and I noticed that the sand was moving, like there were like snakes slithering through it. And I thought, I think now I don't want to be in public, because now it looks like things are going to start moving and breathing, and that's going to, I would rather just experience that without people looking at me funny. And that turned out to be a very good thing, because I become that person on acid at the party. I become that person who's just like, the wood is just so amazing. It's like you got to go into the wood, down to the molecules. These are my notes, such as they are. Because it turns out I could not write. I tried to write, and my hand kept melting into the paper. Because turns out that's one of the things that acid does. And I'll talk about that. It messes with your self-other boundary, and so you kind of can't tell where you end and the rest of you begins. But I was just self-aware enough to know, oh my God, I sound like every stoner acid head ever. It's really kind of embarrassing, I was bonding with the Oriental rug. If you've ever seen that episode of Mad Men where they had that one woman crawling around on the rug, I'm sorry to say that was me. But it was really cool because the patterns would just crawl up my skin, and it was a really wonderful experience. And we took, I'm not going to play it for you, it's literally the most boring video footage ever. It's me in my Doctor Who sweatshirt. I literally just stared at that chair and at the particular piece of wood in the chair for 5 minutes. And then looked up and went, it's quantized, man. You got to go down to the molecules. And then and then I just go back to staring at it. It's just bonding with the wood. What the hell was going on, And, it's LSD is chemically a fascinating substance. It's very, very similar, believe it or not, to serotonin. It was initially developed by Albert Hofmann, who discovered it accidentally, and developed as a treatment for anxiety and depression. And the culture wars of the 60s and early 70s, unfortunately, led to it being classified as a Schedule I drug in 1970, making it pretty much illegal with no medical benefits. Those attitudes are shifting, but one of the reasons we know so little about it and how it affects the brain is that it really, until very recently, scientists were not even allowed to use it. It was just so hard to get approval for an LSD study. But a couple of British scientists have managed to do it. I interviewed one of them. And he really summed it up beautifully. He said, this is the shocking and revelatory thing that people experience with psychedelics, not just acid, but also magic mushrooms and ecstasy and some of the others as well. Ayahuasca, peyote. We have this unconscious feeling that we have always been who we are, and we don't realize that we are a construct. So it can feel as if there is confusion about where we end and the world begins, as if we kind of merge with the world. So it turns out there really is a neuroscience reason why I was crawling on the Oriental rug. And I was pleased to find that Cary Grant was one of the subjects who had therapy with LSD, and it really changed. He basically said, all my life I've been going around in a fog. You're just a bunch of molecules until you know who you are. So I liked that Cary Grant also got caught up in the whole molecule idea. Tells me that my experience was valid. Thank you, Cary, for validating my experience. So it turns out, here's what little we know about how psychedelics work in the brain. Aldous Huxley, was a big proponent of acid, and he had this theory that LSD counters what he called a reducing valve in the brain. That basically what the brain does is reduce all the input, and it chooses what we do and do not experience, and it filters out a whole lot of stuff. And the LSD kind of counters that, so a little more gets in. So it really does expand the doors of perception, as he famously called it in his book. Albert Hofmann, again, who invented it, preferred to think of it more as a biochemical receiver, that the brain is a receiver, and that LSD kind of biochemically alters it and tunes it to a different wavelength. And I think the analogy that I drew in my book is, astronomy tends to look at the night sky in lots of different wavelengths of light. And the sky doesn't change. It's pretty much the same sky, but you see different things when you view it in optical, visible light versus infrared versus gamma radiation versus X-rays. You'll see different things as a result of that. And so it's just another tool. So in that sense, LSD acts as a chemical lens, similar to the kind of filter that you can put on a telescope, and you can actually experience things about how your brain functions that you might not otherwise experience. If that sounds a little vague in 1960s and New Age, think again, science backs him up, both of them up on that. This was a study done in 2012 in England on people under the influence of magic mushrooms. This is a picture of your brain on shrooms. Psychedelics are literally mind expanding. They did a follow-up study with LSD, found the exact same thing. What happens is brain activity does not increase. It's not that when we think of heightened perception, you would think that your brain is actually becoming more active. The opposite is true. Your brain is becoming less active. It turns out that Huxley was right. There is a reducing valve in the brain, and LSD and psychedelics mess with it. So we are actually experiencing more about the world than we would otherwise than would otherwise get through the filter. So I mentioned that it disrupts the body maps. Remember I talked about those schema, those little models that we build for people. We have parts of the brain that are kind of like the like me area and the not like me area. That's how the brain distinguishes between self and other, where we end and where something else begins. There's different parts of the brain where that processing takes place. LSD really messes with that. And it blurs the lines between the self and other. This is a little homunculus. Many of you know that Wilder Penfield in the 1950s and 1960s did these experiments when he was doing brain surgery. He would stimulate certain parts of the brain and see where people felt the sensations. And it turns out that the brain does have these maps, these motor maps and these sensory maps. The ones with the most nerve endings tend to be like the hands and the head and the lips and things where we really, really need those to sense and feel the world. So, the more sensitive and the more nerve endings they had, that became bigger. So you end up with this kind of grotesque homunculus figure. But the LSD messes with those as well, where you just, again, you can't quite, it becomes a little fuzzy, where you end and the self begins. And what I found most interesting, when I talked to my friend over dinner, he basically described his experience on LSD as being without an ego. And I think it depends on how you would define ego. My experience was more that it messed with my body maps because there was still me. I still had a sense of an I. When I closed my eyes, that I was very disembodied, and I was it felt like my molecules kind of drifted apart, and I guess molecules again, I know, and kind of joined with all the other molecules in the world, and I got this great light show that was kind of almost synesthesia-like because the music that was playing, it would kind of respond to, sensation, touch, or sound, or whatever. Very much an Albert Hoffman kind of experience, but I never lost sense of who I was. So for me, it was really, the whole experience was revelatory for the book because of that, because there really is an I. And that's one of the reasons I think that we have such a fear of death, because we really cannot conceive of a world without I. The minute we're born, we come into this world with an I, and we experience it through our perspective. And the fact that the world will go on without us is simply monstrous of it. How could it? And yet it will. But, it's very, very difficult to figure out where this I comes from, as I found when I started talking to some of the consciousness researchers. A lot of it depends, again, on your definition. What does it mean to be consciousness? And I'm just going to put a caveat out there right now that most of what I'm going to be talking about right now for the next couple slides relates to basic wakefulness. And there's a kind of meta-consciousness, or what Patricia Churchland has called fancy consciousness, that is much more complicated and much more to do with personal identity and the meta-self. Advanced cognition, emotions, feelings, beliefs, all those things are sort of advanced. But basic wakefulness, I was pleased to find that we were making some very interesting inroads. In part, our notion of how the brain is structured has really changed, particularly in the last 15 years or so. It used to be you would see like a brain map, and you would see parts of the brain, the language cortex and this and that. And that still exists to a certain extent, but increasingly neuroscientists are realizing that it's not that there's one part of the brain where language is. All of the brain is involved all of the time. There's all these subroutines I'm not even aware of that are going on beneath the surface, that are like below the wakefulness, the self-awareness element. And all of that is going on all the time. So what the brain actually is a network of networks. And there's very strong evidence that it has what's known as a small world structure. Is everyone familiar with small world? Or should I just give a brief? This is a physics mathematical context, but I mean, the best analogy is think of the airline hub. You're looking for the most efficient path to get from A to B. And the reason that the airline hub system works is because if you were trying to fly from LA to New York City, and you just took local flights, used local connections, you'd basically have to take like a dozen flights to get there. You'd have to go from LA to the next airport, and then to the next airport, and to the next one. What the hub system allows airlines to do is just put everybody into these little central areas for processing, and then they can like fan out from there. It gets distributed. And it turns out that nature kind of naturally does that in terms of the brain's anatomical structure. It turns out, and the synaptic connections seem to follow that as well. That this is not, it's not perfect, but it seems that it's the most robust, efficient way that nature has discovered for, in the terms of the brain, getting information from point A to point B as quickly as possible. So yes, a certain part of the brain, the sound, for example, the audio cortex, will be processing incoming sound. We are not going to be aware of that sound unless it gets then transported to central headquarters, so to speak. And then all that stuff, all the input from the various parts of the brain gets integrated, and that's how it builds your experience. So your experience of something, say like this talk, the sound is coming from here, the visual is coming from here, something else is coming from here. The brain integrates all of that together and gives you this experience, and that's how it works. And it's only able to do that because of this small world network. And they've been able to test this with patients under the influence of anesthesia. Most of us have experienced at one point being under general anesthesia, and it turns out that when they did brain scans of people, they found that in fact, even when they were under and completely unconscious, when they would play music, it would register in the audio cortex, but the people would not remember it because it was not getting to the central headquarters of the brain. And then they would wake people up and they would not remember it. They would not be conscious of it. So there's a whole lot of stuff that your brain does that's under, below the radar of consciousness. And if you disrupt the small world network, if you keep that integration from happening, you do not fully experience an event. So that's a real clue there about what consciousness is. Consciousness is emergent And as neuroscientists are now fond of saying, mind is matter. I talked to Christoph Koch, and he basically said, no matter, no mind. If there is no matter, my mind does not exist. Now, what does he mean by that? And what does he mean by emergent? And it has to do with these little sub-processes. When you think of a complex system, again, we're getting into some heavy physics here. What you have is you have all these little individual things, say cars, on a traffic, on a highway. And when you get to a certain density of cars, you get enough of those interactions, and all the drivers are kind of making decisions and moving around and going which way and that. If they reach a certain critical density, something new is going to come out of that, a traffic jam. A traffic jam is an emergent property. If you look at a big chunk of gold is made up of billions of atoms, for example. Gold has properties like temperature, hardness, color. Those properties are not inherent in the individual atoms. It's something new that gets created from all those atoms coming together and interacting with each other. That's what is known as an emergent property, and that appears to be how consciousness, in terms of this basic wakefulness thing, works. That you have all these little neurons, billions of them, and they're all firing away and interacting with each other, and somehow out of all of that noise, all those little subroutines and things going on, whirring under the surface, something new comes out of that, a new property, and that property is consciousness, that basic wakefulness. That seems to be the best way neuroscientists have so far of talking about it. There's some really interesting ideas. Christoph has been working with a guy named Tononi on this concept of phi, where he's looking at redefining consciousness as a type of information, and that your level of consciousness from, basic consciousness of, say, a mammal, like your cat has a certain kind of basic consciousness, but you would not say that it is conscious on the same level that a human being is. That has to do with how rich the integration of information is. And the human beings so far are best at, among the species, of integrating all of that information, so we have a much richer, varied, conscious self. But again, these are all just interesting ideas. This is neuroscience. I talked to Patricia Churchland about this, and she basically said, neuroscience, you don't understand. You come from physics. Physics has been around for 2,000 years at least. Neuroscience, it's really only in the last 100 years that it's even been a discipline. So if you think about it, she goes, honestly, we're pre-Newton. We're pre-Kepler. We're still discovering the moons of Jupiter. We're just discovering that there are moons around Jupiter, which would be Galileo. So they've got a ways to go. But, and again, a lot of this is really just about basic consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, that is often called, is how all of these mechanisms produce a distinct, persistent, and subjective personal identity. And I think that really the only fair thing to say at this point is we really don't know. It's going to be very, very complicated. There are all these projects, brain mapping projects, that are in the works, and I'm sure they'll be very useful in the same way that mapping the human genome was useful. You definitely need to map these things out. This is mapping all the synaptic connections, essentially, the connectome, so to speak. And the problem with that is what we found when we mapped the human genome was that genes turned out to be far more complicated than we ever imagined. And I'm pretty sure, I think we can say with great confidence, it's the same thing is probably going to happen with the connectome. And the other factor is the connectome is the map, but consciousness and who we are is the traffic. And we want to be careful that while the map is very, very useful and we need to know that, let's not confuse it. It's not going to automatically solve the problem of consciousness once we have that. So what do we do with all of this? This is kind of depressing. I basically told you that there's no soul, and we don't understand this, and we don't understand that. So what is the self? Well, how do we deal with all this myriad, unknowns that the uncertainty that we're having to deal with? And we deal with it the way we've always done it. I very deliberately close the book on what's known as the autobiographical self, this notion that we are the stories we tell. It's a way of coming full circle. Like I said, the story that I told about myself, that I was bad at math, the beauty of this approach is I can change that story. I can take in the evidence and realize, wait a minute, I need to think a little more deeply. I can change the story that I tell about myself. I do not have to lock myself into this identity that I created when I didn't know any better. And there's a certain power, I think, in that. And I think it makes sense from a human perspective, because there's a lot of different ways of knowing and understanding. And we pretty much have no choice at this point. I mean, you can map our genome. You can map my genome. You can scan my brain. You can even hypothetically track every single particle and atom in my body and map it out in that respect if you really wanted to be thorough and had a lot of time to do that. But it would not necessarily tell you who I am, because the self, again, is this, it's emergent in a way that consciousness is emergent. You've got all these different things coming together, and out of all of those things, the genes, the brain, the psychology, the interactions, nature and nurture, and all of those things, they all come together, and out of all of those things, something new comes out, and that is ourself. And again, we have a certain amount of power in determining the story that we tell. So if you really want to know who I am, I would say, let me tell you a story. My story, and then you can tell me yours. And that's it. Thank you so much. The book is Me, Myself, and Why, and it took me 2 years to write, so for these reasons, it was hard. I'm delighted to take questions. I'm sure you guys have tons. No? Yes, right there. Oh, I did not. But he'd be happy. He's very open about the fact that he tried this, and he was really kind of hoping he'd get the big physics breakthrough. So he had his little pad ready, because I'm gonna solve quantum gravity. Gosh darn it. And it didn't really work out that way. As he put it, there is just no way you can do rigorous physics on acid. It's and I will tell one funny story, because he's very, I have a very loving, thoughtful husband, and you forget to eat because you're just kind of zoning, man. You're kind of there. Hunger. What is that really? It's a concept. So he decided to make me a bagel. It took him 40 minutes. Because, again, it messes with that self-other boundary, and when you're cutting a bagel, you really don't want that you want that boundary to be clear. So literally, he had to kind of will his molecules back together and really focus. And, physics is all about, rigorous math and focusing and really having to think through things. I think the one thing he might get at some point on acid would be some sort of visual insight that later on he could go back to and then do the rigorous work. But that didn't happen. Mostly he just kind of, all right. He didn't get the light show. I was kind of disappointed in that, because I felt that he kind of missed out on a certain aspect of it. He didn't get the visuals quite as much. But I think he really enjoyed it. It was instructive for both of us. Way in back, yes.
About 18 years ago, I suffered a cardiac arrest while under surgery under anesthetic. 40 minutes, I was flatlined. They were giving me intravenous. They were doing CPR, and I had no memory for 4 days. I had temporary amnesia. But they told me, and this is about your hub theory, that as soon as the doctor said, this lady, looks like this lady's not going to make it, my heart started to how do you explain it?
Really? N of one, that's your argument? I don't think we need to explain it. First of all, I think that, every time someone comes up to me with a near-death experience, and it happens every single time, they keep wanting, my experience means it must be real. And well, your experience is, yes, shared by lots of people, and there's a reason for that. Our brains are all very similar, and we experience very similar things. The brain is constantly trying to make sense of things as it's dying. We don't actually understand a lot of what's going on with the brain, but we do know that if you are not conscious, not remembering, that small world network has been disrupted. And, remember that the brain fills in stuff that didn't necessarily happen. And, we can actually create false memories very, very easily. We'll definitely all see similar patterns and things. A lot of that has to do with the structure of the brain. There's a guy named Jack Cohen. One of the things I looked at in the book was the types of patterns that you see under LSD. Someone described it as, it's like you're watching this, it's the pattern of this, the way the synaptic architecture of the brain, as they fire, they form these beautiful fractal patterns. They form honeycomb patterns, little tunnels, cobwebs, spirals, all these things that we see over and over again in cultures all across the world over millennia. these patterns all show up. And the reason for that is the structure of the brain, the way it all gets folded together, and the way the synapses fire. And that seems to be fairly universal. There's room for some unique experiences and some subjective experience, but basically there's a reason that we all experience these things, these aspects of near-death. There's some very interesting research done on near-death experiences, but again, it's very, very preliminary, and there's, again, very little that we know. But I would caution against putting too much. The guy told you a story and you believed it. You didn't remember it. And again, that would just be one case. And remember that just because your heart started that moment is not necessarily because you somehow heard that. Maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Maybe a sub-process heard it and made a decision to kick you out, and we don't know because we're still studying those sub-processes. But your conscious self did not make that decision. Yes?
I think the point you're making is a good one. It was a favorable outcome in your situation. But what surgeons have learned is that what's said in the operating room is heard.
Well, as I said, the lower things are still, your lower functions are still there. Again, those subroutines are still going, but it's not a fully conscious experience if it's not integrated. That's why I make the distinction between that.
One illustration was a woman who was convinced that she had cancer, even though the biopsy was negative, because evidently during the surgery, the surgeon made the comment, "Uh-oh, this doesn't look good." And she had heard it at some level, and that it had influenced her. Mm-hmm.
Look, the subroutines definitely do influence, but it's not part of your conscious experience, and that is the importance of the small world disruption. Yeah, I didn't even get into free will. I actually asked someone, and he just said, "Oh God, don't go there," because philosophers are still debating that. I mean, what does it mean? Because there is a certain, if you're a physics person, as I am, there is a certain determinism to the actions of particles. But there's also different levels of being, of understanding, of description. And Sean has actually spoken, I think, to this very crowd about that very thing, and has some wonderful things to say on that topic about the different ways of just different levels of describing things. And it's actually fine to have a level of which where we basically talk as if we are making choice, even though it might be a subroutine somewhere down making the choice for us. I personally would argue if the subroutine's making the choice, that's still me. So some part of me is making a choice. It's just not a conscious choice.
But the point I really wanted to emphasize was this last one that you did, the power of the cohesive narrative about one's life.
Yes. The brain wants it to be a cohesive narrative, and it will do anything it can to create it.
There's experiments of women who have been sorely abused as children cannot mother their infants. Women who have been sorely abused as children who have a cohesive narrative can mother their infants.
Yeah, the narrative is very powerful, yes. Do we have actual questions? Yes, right here.
Can you address the mind-brain intersect?
That actually is summed up in the mind is matter. Again, it's kind of like we like these either ors, right? We like mind or matter. Descartes was famous for the mind-body problem. Modern neuroscience, based on everybody that I interviewed, and I interviewed about 25 of the leading neuroscientists in the field, all pretty much say the same thing. With a couple of minor, with maybe David Chalmers being the one exception, but he's a neurophilosopher. That again, it comes out of the interactions. That if you don't have the matter, then you don't have the mind. That you cannot. That you can't have one without the other. And this does have very important implications, because when you hear about people wanting to upload themselves into computers, that's the other question that I'm sure someone here is going to ask. So let me just answer it. It's not that it's impossible. It's just that you would, what we've discovered about the brain is that the body, the physical part of the brain, the actual architecture, your body and how it interacts and moves through space, all of these things actually influence our conscious self in ways that we're only just now beginning to understand. So if you want to do this uploading, you would have to recreate all of this, not even necessarily in silicone, but you'd have to build a computer that acted like all of this blood and bone somehow comes together and builds this. And that is robust and adaptive, and we just don't know how to do that. It's not going to happen in the next 20 to 50 years. I'm not saying it can't be done, but let's just really appreciate just how significant the challenge is. Way in back right there.
How do you factor in dreams into your analysis? And
I did not.
Are they a substitute for this LSD light show experience that we could just go see? What was the movie 2001 if we want a light show? But, dreams aren't they much more of a personal experience?
I did not look into dreams because I had to limit my scope to a little bit. I don't think that LSD is always there is going to be a subjective element of LSD in the same that there's a subjective thing for dreams. Dreaming is something very, very different than LSD. LSD, they actually do know it's specifically attacking, or I shouldn't say attacking, it's specifically affecting certain receptors in the brain, and those receptors seem to, influence, among other things, the self-other boundary and exactly what kinds of things get past our perceptual filter. That's a very, very different mechanism than what you're talking about with dreams. Right over here.
Your description of your LSD thing makes me think, do you think that you would try it again?
I get asked that question too, and I would have no problem trying again. And you might want to. I would actually argue that it would be useful to try it again and see if I had the same experience. It was not easy to. It's not like I have my dealer like down on the corner. It's like. CF, not the anti-alcoholic, It's like, so and you do lose a couple days, and so it's not like I'd be opposed to it, but we really had to make an effort, man. We had to friend of a friend of a friend and schedule out a weekend and do all these. We had someone on speed dial just in case because we didn't want to be irresponsible about it, So it just took a lot of organizing, and I'm just not sure I have that in me to do it if I don't have a book to write.
We have some upstairs, by the way.
Awesome. Yes, this lady right here in blue.
If I promise to buy this book, will you address how I can lose weight using calculus?
Well, people got mad at me for that subtitle. I was, trying to get people to get over the fear of calculus because, it's not necessarily a secret, right? Calculus is a way of taking a logic problem and reducing it into something that's manageable and into a language of symbols. And, there's a spherical cow answer to that, which everybody knows, correct? Which is, you have to burn more calories than you take in, which is true. But overly reductionist because it does not take into account the huge number of variables that are involved in that simple equation. And the fact that we actually don't know how to measure that, and that certain things can affect things like metabolic rate, and that we don't necessarily. If I do the same exercise over and over again, I'm going to burn less calories over time doing the same thing because my body just gets used to it and very efficient. The body really tries to, in many ways, trick us into not losing weight. And I'm now 50, so you can imagine what's happening to me at my age. It's like, and that all affects everything. So the basic thing is true, but how many calories you need to function, how many calories you burn just by being, it's really, really hard to figure out what that value is. And that's, I think, why so many of us struggle to lose weight. Does that help at all? Yeah, see, there you go. But the calculus book is one of my favorites, actually, because it tries to humanize math, and it tries to get you to look at, math as a tool for helping you make better decisions and not as some magic thing where if you learn all the rules, you have the answers to the universe, because that's not what it is. Way over here.
Did you have any surprise revelations from your genotyping?
Well, I was surprised to find that I was, at a risk for alcoholism. I wouldn't call it really surprising. It was more, some of the stuff is very obvious and confirmed things that I'd been told. That was nice seeing science confirm it. I mean, otherwise it's hearsay. I mean, I literally have a little piece of typewritten paper from the orphanage, the adoption agency that, this baby's mother is, this height, this weight, this ancestry, good at this, it was literally a paragraph for my biological mother, my biological father. That's all I knew. And what little was there was verified by 23andMe, which was very useful. It's one of those things where people ask me, well, don't you really know who you are? I says, yes, this book was actually about why, not who. And so it really wasn't that I was looking for surprises. Some people have found surprising things. This one woman actually found her biological father on 23andMe, and you've got people. Paul Nurse tells this wonderful story of, not necessarily through 23andMe, but discovering that the woman he thought was his sister was actually his mother. He was born in an era where that's just what happened. She goes away for 9 months and comes back, and and suddenly the mother just, whoops, late pregnancy. I'm going to raise this baby. as mine, even though, so his sister was actually his mother. So things like that have been known to happen. I think that one of the things that the service does, and I think most are going to start doing, is before it shows you results for serious conditions like Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, they ask you whether or not you really want to know, because that's a personal choice. I'm one of those people that prefers to know. Just tell me the worst up front, because if I know the worst, then I can start to deal with it. But other people are not like that. Other people maybe it will make them very, very anxious, and it will ruin their lives. That will weigh on them. That fear will weigh on them so much that they just don't want to know. So I think that we need to be sensitive to that people are different and have different responses and psychological needs. Right over here. I'm trying to mix it up a little.
I have another question about the LSD. Never tried it, never scares you. The Doors was my favorite band in high school, so I have no idea what you're talking about. But,
See, I hate the Doors.
I still have no idea. I still don't. But my point is, I feel like I read a lot about spiritual advisors or psychics or whatnot who have used LSD in their stories about talking to the guardian angel. One that pops up in mind is Karen Miss, and she had the our biggest seller of the books about the chakras, and then she goes into a story about this woman that tried acid and spoke to her guardian angel, and then was on cloud nine to the day she died. And it sounds so real, these experiences from somebody that has never tried it, and it makes me anxious when I hear them. But I guess what I'm trying to ask is why, when some people do LSD, they feel like they have this spiritual experience and...
Well, I don't think there's any mystery there. I mean, we actually, it's affecting your brain chemistry in very profound ways. It's affecting your perception of reality. That it's true. I mean, the reality as we perceive it is a construct. Your brain is building it. It's a real thing, but it is not an illusion, but it is a construct. And many people find that very upsetting. The other thing is, it turns out that many psychedelics are very useful for end-of-life counseling for terminally ill patients for this very reason. Now, she may have talked about a woman who met a guardian angel and had this wonderful, spiritual experience. That was not my experience at all. It's going to be subjective. It's going to be unique to you. And it's also going to be unique to your mood at the time. I mean, one of the things that we were very careful to do was to tailor our environment and make sure that there was going to be nothing upsetting, there, because it's very, very easy to have a bad trip. Psychedelics are very unpredictable, or it's predictably unpredictable, I think is the way the way people have put it. I don't think there's a big mystery there. I just think that, it awakens you to the fact that there's a little bit more to, we think of reality as being what we can see, hear, feel, and touch. And what we don't think about is that what we see, hear, feel, and touch is affected by what our brain chooses to let us experience. And when LSD messes with that, it makes us realize that there could be something more out there beyond which gets past the filter. To me, that's just reality. To other people, they might interpret that the story that they end up telling is about this other realm, so to speak. And it's not necessarily a new realm. It's just stuff that doesn't normally gets in a little bit and leaks through. And that can be very profoundly transforming for someone if that's the story that they decide is meaningful to them. And I personally felt the same thing. I mean, I liked the fact that when I closed my eyes, there was an eye, but it was kind of floating in this sea of molecules, and I was kind of part of everything else. And it did kind of take away some of the death anxiety, I have to say. It's like, what, it's okay. I'll just get merged, I'll die, and my molecules will go back, with everything else, and there's a sense some part of me will be lived on and maybe even, becomes part of something else at some point, and that's okay. So to me, that's all it is. But people are going to interpret it differently because that's what we do as human beings. We take our subjective experience and we create a story of it. And, it can help us cope. It can help us do a lot of things. It's not necessarily a bad thing. Right there, the woman in the purple.
I was wondering, in continuing with your analogy with the dating, if you had any plans to investigate the science of romance, and because we hear so many stories, men like women that are this shape, and women like men that are this amount taller, and the man needs to pay or the woman won't have sex, those are statistical means. Right. I just wondered if you had any plans to maybe investigate that from a science or biological aspect.
I did not look into that. I looked at, obviously sexual attraction, sex and gender. Love actually goes a little bit more deeply. It's way deeper than just, the cuddle chemical. Any of you have ever heard Carol Tavris speak? She has a wonderful line that, oxytocin actually is, it's more a cuddle your own kind and the hell with the rest of you kind of chemical, because what it actually it's how we form tribal alignments, so to speak, alliances. There's a lot to that, but you have to bear in mind that those studies, they're basically those studies are dangerous because they're looking at a whole group of people. They tend to be, college students, predominantly white, upper middle class college students, because that's who's available for their studies. So you have to look at who was in the study sample. You have to look at how many are in the sample, and you have to understand that they, again, are looking for where the most clumping is, and they're looking for a strong statistical signal where they could see a little spike above a certain threshold. And all those things taken together does not necessarily mean there aren't a million outliers. It's a long tail. It's and in the same way that sex and gender, most of us might bulk up, show up like. Most of us might be right here, but there's going to be a huge, rich, varied continuum that goes all the way down, and I think it's the same for anything. So I would be very, very cautious about interpreting those studies. Way in back, right there.
When they made these little insects and animals drunk, and did they become was there a certain percentage of them that became aggressive to other animals?
Oh, no.
Humans do,
Well, yeah, I mean, human beings are complicated and much more complicated than a fruit fly is going to be. They are really just looking at drunken alcohol tolerance, but they did find something interesting with the fruit flies, and it's a funny story. They found that, here's what happens. Female fruit flies, once they've mated, there's a very elaborate courtship ritual with fruit flies, and once a female fruit fly is mated, she basically rejects all other virgin males. She'll like and not nicely. She'll shove them away. She'll beat them up. She's just really mean about it. So what Ulrike did was she decided that she would test what apparently is called social defeat in fruit flies, because fruit flies actually are useful for studying memory because they do remember some of their experiences. So they're great as a little insect model. So she put these virgin male fruit flies in with these females who had already mated, and let them be rejected for like 2 solid hours. And then put them back in the inebriabometer, and she found that they basically got drunk so fast. It's like they just drowned their sorrows. It's like, woe is me. And the male fruit flies who'd been allowed to mate were just, I'll take a little sip, kick back, I'm good. And so, I mean, we want to anthropomorphize, right? We want to think, they're just like us. And in fact, she told this to a group of Hollywood producers, and one guy said, "Tell me more about how sex with virgins can cure alcoholism." And it's of course not what she said. But it did make her think about what was the mechanism that was going on there. And what she found was that the act of mating actually releases some sort of chemical, and therefore they crave less alcohol. And when they don't get that chemical release, the alcohol is a way, again, of self-medicating. They need to drink a little bit more to make up for it. Because if she then let the male fruit fly, the virgin males mate, then they suddenly are not wanting to drink again. I mean, it's what really is about a chemical kind of imbalance that's going on there. It's very, very insightful and also really funny. So, the blonde woman right there.
Do you know are there going to be more studies? I don't know what's allowed for LSD, mushroom, Molly.
There's actually wonderful news on that front. The British group did manage to do another study on LSD as well as magic mushrooms, and we're starting to see a few more. They're starting to loosen the reins a little bit on the. It's getting a little bit easier, not much easier, but I'm very encouraged by seeing the legalization of marijuana that's happening. There's an organization up in San Francisco called MAPS that has been for many years trying to compile, actual academic peer-reviewed studies demonstrating that the Class 1 schedule classification is just wrong. There are definitely some potential medical benefits, and we will not know, and we cannot learn much about how it reacts with the brain and other aspects. if we aren't allowed to test it. Among other things, there's a compound in ayahuasca called banisterine that targets dopamine receptors that could be a palliative way to treat Parkinson's. But we won't know if we can't test it. So increasingly, I think we're seeing movement towards people really pushing and saying, you've got to, not necessarily like legalize it and have it all be a free-for-all, but you've got to loosen the reins and change the classification so that scientists can actually use these substances under controlled circumstances. It's useful for end-of-life counseling. It was originally designed for anxiety, and it's really, we need to get over this sort of 60s tarnish from the culture wars. It's no longer relevant. Psychedelics have had a bad rap for too long. So that would be my take, and I think that we're seeing some encouraging signs along those lines.
Let's do 2 more questions.
2 more questions right here.
Well, are these drugs harmful? I mean, is there any scientific evidence that they are harmful?
Well,
most of what I've heard about drugs is that they're not healthful things.
Well, I would say that I was slightly nauseous and headachy when I was on acid, and the light show made up for that. But that's just how I personally respond to it. I think that with any drug, there are going to be side effects. Correct. And how are you using the drug? Are you combining it with alcohol and different other kinds of drugs? There's been a few deaths from Molly, for example. You mentioned Molly, and a lot of that is that these kids are just taking it. First of all, we don't know if it's Molly because they're getting it on the street. They're combining it with alcohol. They're not drinking enough water. They're probably combining it with other things because that's what kids do. They just down anything, and we don't know what those interactions are because they haven't been studied. So. But the reason that you take a drug, any drug, is because the benefits for you personally, for your condition, outweigh the risks. Every single prescription drug that we have that's legal comes with a series of disclaimers. We've all heard them. It goes on and on and on, those lists. It makes you never want to take a drug ever again for your condition. And that's what we should be using. I talked to Rick Doblin, who's the head of MAPS, and he had this wonderful quote. He says, we have a tendency to demonize the drug. And that's not what we should be doing. We want to look at what is your relationship to the drug. How do you treat that drug? How does it affect you? What are the conditions that it can help you with? And what are the ways you're going to react to that might not be good? And weigh those and do the benefits outweigh the risks and make individual decisions. That's how I would approach it. To me, that's a sensible drug policy. One more right here.
Isn't the problem the dose? Because if it is a very big dose, it's going to be a poison. If it is a lower dose, it may be acceptable.
I will say that most of the deaths associated with any kind of psychedelic are not from an overdose per se. Obviously, you can overdose on anything. You can overdose on water. There have been people who died from drinking too much water too fast. And that's water. Again, you don't want to demonize the drug. Most of the time when you have accidental deaths, it's because of things like the effects. Maybe you don't respond as quickly. Maybe you find yourself, maybe you combine it with something else, or, they tend to be accidental, as a result of that. So I would just reiterate, don't demonize the drug. Look at the relationship, how it's being used, weighing the risks versus benefits for specific people. And that should be our approach.
Thanks, Jennifer.
Thank you all for coming and asking such great questions.
By the way, a couple quick announcements, and I want to plug 2 things. First of all, the book is on sale outside, deeply discounted for you people. There is no free will, by the way. I see you all buying one of the books. Also, Jennifer's husband, Sean, and Steve Novella were in a really great debate not long ago about is death final or not. And Sean and Steve Novella they were the perfect combination, a physicist and a doctor of medicine, a neurologist. And they were the perfect team, I thought, for coming up with this argument. So do check out that. It's on the Q, Intelligence Q?
It was... I can't even remember the name.
Just Google Sean Carroll, Steve Novella, and Life After Death or something like that, and it'll come up. It's like a 2-hour debate, and it's really fantastic. Thanks again to Jennifer.